The lecture about the Boxer Rebellion had weighed heavily upon Tom's mind for most of the prior week, at least until the seminar on marriage fundamentals wandered into his life. Now, as he worked his way through the events of 1900 and 1901, it was almost as if he felt switched off. The irony of the lesson was that the rebellion hadn't been a rebellion at all. The resentment leading to the movement had been anti-foreign, anti-colonial, and anti-Christian, in response to the world powers trying to undermine the Qing dynasty. From the beginning, views differed on whether the Boxers reflected a movement or were futile opponents of the inevitability of change. Regardless, for the best part of 2 years, the movement began with Boxers ravaging the countryside, destroying foreign property, and attacking missionaries in the name of self-rule, and ended in bloody destruction, rape, pillage, and plunder by the colonial powers, enduring reparations by the Chinese, and reduction of the Qing dynasty to little more than a puppet government. The more things changed, the more they stayed the same. It became a little-regarded incident in the history of Earth, in comparison to other conflicts, yet it set the stage for so very much more. It was also a lesson that would have been timely back home. As it was, the girls seemed to be paying close attention. As far as the class went, most of the girls looked abashed, the irony of the lesson and its implications not missing its mark. Desala looked thoughtful. He wasn't certain if that was a good thing or not. The end of class left him with only his private concerns for the afternoon's marriage fundamentals seminar. One more hurdle to jump, and then he could get back to a welcome routine of walking out to the biology building for his non-existent chess club, and time in the museum while teaching Deshin English, before meeting up with Miv for the evening. It wasn't just the seminar, either. The last week felt more like a month. Not bad. Alright, most of the show with the Rochers hadn't been a treat, but the rest, it had been a full week. Things with Mevere had cleared up nicely, though visiting a tailor to buy clothes for just one date had been different. To imagine he thought Burdin was florid. He still had to try the thing on tonight, and Miv was keen to do a final inspection before his date with Sholea. It felt like being sent off to first grade. Nesfa looked like she was on pins and needles every time he spoke to her, though all still seemed to be going well for her. Kanya had taken a particular delight in hearing the details, but whatever she had planned, and it was something, she was fully on board with taking care of Nesfa's arrangement. That much was a relief. As for the interview, that would air tonight. Miv had pestered him to watch it, but he'd begged off. Ganya was going to. The legal department was absolutely going to. All he wanted was to put it out of his mind, have dinner, try on the suit, and brace himself. After the marriage fundamentals seminar. There was at least Jama's advice from the day before yesterday, and he was going to put that to use, if he could get past reading the material, to the questions section without breaking out in hysterical laughter. It didn't seem polite, but if it was a test, it was one he felt he might surely fail. He was packing up, and glancing over to where Mevere stood talking with Letzi and the twins, when Melondi and Belder approached the desk, looking at each other and at him. Melondi had reached him first, so first come, first served. Miss Melondi? Miss Belder? Can I help you? Setting aside his bag, he pocketed his omnipad and settled back against the desk. Professor. Melondi looked at Belder uncertainly, but Belder appeared only too happy for her to go first, so she pressed on. I was wondering, you mentioned there were some other musicals and shows you have, and I kind of wanted to talk to you. Oh, that. Tom drew in a breath, then briefly chewed his bottom lip. Tell you a secret. I have a whole pile of videos I pulled aside over in the museum collection. I wasn't going to share them with you, in case you took them the wrong way, but I think after 2 days on China, Cambria, Suvastutav, the Boxer Rebellion, and the Wars of Refusal, you're old enough to decide for yourself what you think. That's kind of the point. Grab Deshin and tell her to take you over to the box in Container 3. You'll find them in a small box in the back. Just copy the hard drive. And just copy it? Melondi looked rooted to the spot. I'd take you, but I have just enough time for lunch before heading over to give a seminar. Well, read one at least. Tom thought about it a second and grinned. If Melondi could take a week of rebellions, revolts, and insurrections, she could take Les Miserables. And she had such a passion for music, that would probably be her main concern. Just stay out of the box of clothes and the picture albums. Those are personal, alright? Both girls turned bright blue, and Melondi's mouth opened and closed once or twice, as Belder stepped in. Thank you, sir. I need to see Deshin over lunch, and Melondi and I will tell her. Belder nudged Melondi in the ribs slightly. Won't we? Oh, yes, definitely. Last box in the container and stay out of any books. Melondi seemed to galvanize herself into action, then paused. Professor, you weren't going to share them? Not at first, no, he frowned, picking over how he felt about it. You may have heard I'm going to be on an interview tonight. Between that and this week's class, I'm starting to wonder if I've been censoring myself a bit too much. Anyway, just steer clear of 2 called Cats and the Rocky Horror Picture Show, eh? Just those? Melondi looked a bit surprised, then shook her head. I mean, why those, sir? Well, if Cats didn't confuse you, I'm absolutely positive that Rocky Horror would, he said with a snort and grinned. Besides, it's a terrible movie unless you know the jokes. I don't think you have squirt guns or fishnet stockings. What a... And you just made my point, Miss Melondi. The thought brightened his day. God love Tim Curry. That film would never make the leap to Shil'vati culture. Shil loved community archives, but Rocky Horror just had to be too obscure. Is there anything else? Melondi shot a look at Belder, then turned back to him. No. That is... Thank you, Professor. My pleasure. Oh, and if I don't bring you some classical music to the next class, remind me. I have something I think you might enjoy. He gave an amiable nod before looking over to Belder. Now, what can I do for you, Miss Belder? Mel, I may need a bit. Why didn't you go talk to Deshin about that box, and I'll catch up with you, Belder said, nodding over towards Deshin and Jaxme, who were hanging around the exit. Melondi took off hurriedly to catch the pair, and Belder watched for a moment. Professor, I'd kind of like to talk to you about the seminar, if that's all right. Before we have this afternoon session, I mean. Tom felt his smile falter, but tried to keep it in place. Sure. A few minutes? Let me tell Professor Pelivan I need a bit of time, and I'll catch up to her for lunch. I'll be right with you. Professor, I wanted to ask you some advice about dating a human, Belder said, as they walked through the commons. She looked down at him as his face froze up a bit and hurried to explain. It's about something with my boyfriend. I'm pretty sure he's my boyfriend. We're seeing each other again, and we're spending time with his sister, so it's really important. That is, if that goes all right, then there will be a third date, and a third date for a Shil'vati is very important, you know? I didn't, actually. Warwick paused and moved over to stand by one of the benches, but after looking at it a moment, decided to stand. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, though. So, you were wondering... How fast do things get serious with humans? Between women and men, I mean. Looking around, she lowered her voice as a trio of students walked by. I know you're seeing Professor Pelavon, and I kind of wondered, how fast do human men get serious? That's going to depend a lot on the circumstances and the man. He sighed thoughtfully and sat down on the bench, nodding for her to join him. I haven't met your friend, but it's something you should talk to him about. I thought you were pretty happy about it. It kind of caught me by surprise when you were shaking your head at me the other day. Mind if I ask why? Oh, I am. Liam is wonderful. She started, but felt her chest getting tight as she played out the explanation in her mind. I mean, all the girls who know me have been asking because they're curious. Really curious. But if I get to a third date? Or worse, if I don't after meeting his matriarch? That looks pretty bad. If the whole auditorium knew, and then I mess it up, I'd be... And the other girls would, Go looking for leftovers? Alright, I definitely do get that, Professor Warwick said dryly, as he peered at her. Look, when his sister isn't there, just ask what he wants out of the future. If he's thinking about you being in it, then the conversation will go there sooner or later. Don't text him about it, talk face to face. If you're interested in each other that way, just have some faith he'll say something. Pretty much if you get to the 5th date with a human, you're going steady. Tell him what you're thinking, what you're feeling. Be honest, be kind. I don't think you'll have any problems with that. Thank you. I'll try when I talk to him. The question was nagging in her mind. Professor? Mm-hmm. What you said about being honest and not censoring yourself back in class? You told us that your wife died in the landings. Belder felt herself blushing, and wished to the goddess she could test each word before she spoke them out loud. Why didn't you say that the other day? Ah, noticed that, did you? Warwick looked away, down at the pavement, and kicked at it. I was a little sidetracked by the material, but I honestly didn't think telling the class about that would help. I didn't want to hurt feelings. You were all just children when it happened. But isn't how you handle loss important in relationships? I mean, I'm pretty scared about losing Liam, and I want to know anything I can do to keep him. She peered at him, her stomach churning as she tried to resolve the answer. Isn't staying together important to humans too? More than I've said, but none of the girls asked, and I didn't want to look like I was just crying about my life or the Imperium, he said, curling forward and rubbing the side of his forehead roughly. And you should be happy to be trying something new. I know I am with Professor Pelavon. If you're happy, say something. Why haven't you said anything about seeing the professor then? She asked. I mean, I don't want to pry, sir. I expect it's complicated for you both, but what I'm doing is complicated for me too. Maybe, he replied, without conviction. Belder watched as he closed his eyes and hunched over for a while before speaking again. Look, I was raised as a Christian. It's one of our dominant religions, but at heart, I've been a Taoist for a long time. In some places it's a religion, but mostly it's a philosophy. What's it about? She asked, feeling herself on unfamiliar ground. Well, the Tao is the world, the universe really. A long time ago, a human named Lao Tse wrote a book called the Tao Te Ching. It's about living in harmony with the world around you and staying happy under all circumstances. Oh. Belder looked at the man who seemed to be curling uncomfortably into himself on the bench. Have you read it? Tom got through the second class easily enough. The text provided by Professor Burgress flowed past his eyes, as he numbly ploughed through page after page of material, without any hint of laughter. Alright, maybe he struggled with a line or two, but it was just reading and getting through it. His sense of humour had been suspended. Have you read it? Lingered in his mind, as he churned through the pages, one after another. It wasn't fair. Loss was hard. Even at that age in their lives, How many had considered losing loved ones as anything more than an abstract that waited out there for someday? Isn't how you handle loss important in life and relationships? That was a question too. It didn't feel fair, but that didn't make the question any less valid. One of the girls had asked him about the loss of his wife. He looked at the seat where she had been, but saw a different face there today, and without hesitation he had ducked and called it an accident. At the time, he thought it was an answer intended to save their feelings, and that was more than technically true, but it wasn't all of it. These were young women, not children, and he'd given them lies for children. Lies for children was easy. It was saying something that wasn't true, but still led to a better understanding of how things worked, when a complicated but accurate answer would only be confusing. It was like comparing an atom to the solar system. It wasn't remotely true, but it still gave someone a concept they could grow and build on. Anyway, no one had asked how it happened, so he'd gotten away with it. Today was another day. He shut the folio of notes he'd been reading from, and looked up into the auditorium. Now, that concludes today's lecture. Closing the book with a vague sense of surreal disbelief, he looked up at the audience. All right, he'd stolidly made his way through the lecture. He felt like a stone inside, but it was done. Are there any questions? The girls in the hall were quiet. Good grief. Had his delivery been that awful? Anyone? A hand went up. Yes? Belda Sasana. Belda stood up in the back row, where she was sitting next to Prasala. Sir, you've told my class that your wife and daughter were killed during the Imperial landing on your world. She paused at the shocked murmurs that rose around the room before raising her voice. I want to apologize for that. I can only imagine how that would feel to a Shil'vati. The thing is, I'm dating a human. The chorus of mutters rose several octaves as the audience swiveled to look at Belda in wild surprise. I want to ask, sir, what you think Shil'vati and humans have in common when it comes to relationships. She went there, ran through his mind, as girls started to stare. One was starting to laugh, and at least two others in the front row were making faces of staunch disbelief as they glared at Belda. Quiet, he said, keeping his eyes upon Belda. Sitting just beside her, Prasala nodded to some of the other girls and reached over, patting Belda on the back. Quiet, please, he called out, leaning into the microphone. The choir of mutters and sound died down, though it didn't disappear in the susurrus of shifting bodies and whispers. Yes, Miss Sasona, I'm aware of the young man you've been seeing. You really went there, but you put her own neck on the line too. The question has been asked, quiet please, about the value Shil'vati and humans share in relationships. Ah well, in for a penny. I am currently seeing a Shil'vati woman, and I have a date with a member of her family tomorrow evening on Shell. That got their attention. What to say, though? He tried to pick through everything the vile folio before him had lain out, then thought of Bever, of Jama, Ganya, and the loss of his wife. There are some important things we have in common. He looked up at Belda as he was delivering her answer, but around the room, omnipads were coming up and pencils were being readied. First, from everything I've seen is about how you're with someone you want to share your life with. A healthy relationship means being there for someone when they need you, and trusting them to be there for you. Don't nag. Bad things will happen in life, and when they do, you have to be able to let them go, and love one another. Be patient. Be generous. Above all, be kind. Be passionate. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the girl with the flower purse starting to smile. He stopped looking at Belda and gave her a warm smile and a shrug. My mother always told me that you should enjoy life and be able to share that part of you with the people you love. I hope your fathers told you that too. Be open with your husbands and co-wives, because the precious moments in life can be there 1 minute and gone the next. Share your lives. That means be considerate of each other's needs as you try and fulfill your own. Girls were taking notes again, and he thought of the other evening with Miv. There were a few things he could do to make their relationship better. Keep your complaints private and talk to each other about them. You wouldn't want your house secrets out, so don't hurt the people you love by doing that. You need to communicate with your partners as you plan your lives together. The people you love are your fortress against the world. Come on out! Miv banged on the bedroom door. Out, out, out! You have got to be kidding. Tom stared at himself in the mirror and raised his voice. I look like Dracula at a discotheque, in high heels. I don't know who that is. Does he dress nicely? Tom couldn't profane the memory of Bela Lugosi that way, and grumbled, He can. The suit looked perfect at the shop, Miv called back. Are the measurements off? He looked at the garment again. It fit. It wasn't really his style, but it fit. Bell-bottom slacks reached down just over the shoes. No, not shoes, chop-ins. Polished to a mirror shine and lifting him another 2 inches to a full 6'4". The shirt had a deeply plunging neckline and flared collar reaching halfway to his shoulders. The tailor was so frantic about his chest hair that Tom thought he was going to spontaneously combust. The entire ensemble was just a forest green so dark it was nearly pitch black, save for a decorative band of concentric gold rings that wrapped around the flared cuffs at his wrists and ankles. That, and the gold belt around his waist. When Miv explained they were her house colours, he knew the whole thing was a foregone conclusion. I look ridiculous, he thought. Miv loves it, floated through just after. All right, fair's fair. You wore the bikini. He sighed, opening the door, and stepped out into the living room. Miv was sitting on the couch and sat up like a starving man about to be served a buffet. So, do you like it? Letzi poked her head inside the video room, cautiously. So, he's accepted the date for the last date of Shell, but what do I say to his sister? Belder asked one of the curballs, who was sitting to either side of her, as she stared at her omnipad. Nespa looked up from the couch and pulled a bowl aside. Her look wasn't hostile, but it was far too cool to be welcoming. I don't know which one to pick, Melondi muttered to Jaxme, as she scrolled down her omnipad. I'm through about half of it. It's a great adventure, but that's way too long for just tonight. Hey, at least it didn't give you heart failure by the end of it. Jaxme leaned in over Melondi's shoulder to look at whatever was on her omnipad. Look, we have the room blocked off for us tonight, so what's the big deal? I showed you the Rocky Horror, didn't I? Melondi looked at Jaxme incredulously. He was just in those gold shorts and... She paused, seeing Nestha. Around the room, some of the other girls looked back at her, as she lingered in the doorway. At least Dr. Frank was acting normally, shrugged Jaxme. Way too much makeup on a man, but still, I just didn't understand the rest of it. Jaxme paused, following Melondi's glance her way. Don't you have the wrong room? Basala said harshly, from where she and Kellogg were sitting, off to the side. No, she doesn't. One of the twins spoke up. Letzi knew she must be Kamara, since she didn't know Caslin. Now the whole room was looking at her, and the reactions were mixed at best. Kellark looked rebellious but glanced back at the twin. Deshin was looking at her too. It didn't take a lot of imagination to understand the unfriendly expressions. She'd been beside Desala far too many times when the older girl had her claws out. Even if she'd only played the part of a very silent partner, it was no absolution. Being fair, Letzi couldn't exactly blame them, and she felt herself edging back toward the door. "Letzi, come on in," Kamara said, before looking at the others. "Letzi has put in a lot of work fixing up the flyers and the program for the show. I invited her to join us tonight. That isn't a problem, is it?" The question didn't sound anywhere as certain as Letzi would have liked. "Mara's right," Jaxmi offered, but stopped there, reading the room. The silence that sprang up was awkward, as girls were all looking at one another. "Hey." Deshin rolled over from where she lay in front of the couch. A few of the girls glanced over, as Letzi tried to count all the times Desala had made fun of her clothes, not being quite right. Her stomach was in a knot, and she braced herself to leave as she met Deshin's eyes, waiting to be shown the door. At least then she could leave. "Get the lights and grab a cushion." Deshin canted her head to the space next to her. "There's room over on the floor next to me and Melondi." Okay," Letzi said meekly. It wasn't what she expected. Her stomach was still clenched, but she found the dimmer for the lights and made her way over, past Nesfa, who nodded and found the space, nodding at Kamara as she settled down next to Deshin. Kamara nodded back, but got distracted by whatever Belda and her sister were looking at. "So, what are we watching?" "We've been watching human movies." Deshin pointed to the video screen. "It's where we got the idea for the show and some other things. They're pretty good." She paused and raised her voice with a grin. "But Mel nearly had heart failure this week watching something." "I did not. It just caught me by surprise." Melondi stuck her tongue out briefly, before looking back at her omnipad. "It looked like war footage. Anyway, I still woke up dreaming about that huge pair of lips." "At least they were singing in that one. Ow!" Jaxmi's grin was cut short as Melondi elbowed her in the ribs slightly. "Alright, fine. But which one are we going to watch?" "We reserved the room for class studies so no one gets the wrong idea," Nesva said, as she passed the bowl over to Kellark. "Some of the things we've been watching are pretty racy, but Professor Warwick has shared some of his home collection. Stuff none of us has seen before. We decided to start screening it before having open movie nights again, so no one gets the wrong idea." "What? Like new Arnold movies?" Leslie perked up. "I know the Ministry of Culture started screening things." "Can you blame them? Half the Empire nearly had their clams explode when they saw him shirtless," snorted Prasala, who was sitting just behind her. "I mean, alright, everyone's seen it by now, but can you blame the Ministry for trying?" Belda looked up at that and shot Prasala a dirty look, before typing on her omnipad, and Letzi found herself nodding. The influx of human folks had been shocking at first. She knew there were still some things you could only find on the dark end of the datanet. "So, these movies are like porn?" she asked. "Just pick the one at the bottom. We can start working our way up the list," said Jaxmi, poking at Melondi's omnipad before heading over to the couch. "It's not like that." Kellark still wasn't looking very friendly, but at least her expression was conversational. As she looked around, Deshin at her, she pointed to the screen. "You have to remember that these were made before the landings. Males taking off their shirts didn't mean anything. Just focus on what's going on in the film." "You get used to this," nodded Deshin agreeably, as Kellark finished picking through the bowl and passed it over. "You're working with him?" Letzi asked, as she looked into the bowl. About a dozen little rectangles wrapped in red plastic were still in the bottom. The professor, I mean. Mm-hmm. I changed my major to English studies, she nodded, picking through the bowl and pulling out 2 of the cubes. I've learned some things you wouldn't believe. I mean, the class is great, but I'm getting to learn all the modern stuff too. Really? Like what? She asked, as Melondi settled down on her left. Like the first rule, Melondi said unsettlingly, earnestly, as she pointedly stared at the bowl in Deshin's hands. What's the first rule? Letsy offered a smile. It felt like something you'd say in a secret cabal. The first rule is that nobody talks about the chocolate, ever, because if everybody knows, then there won't be any to go around. So, promise on your father's heart and the Empress? Said Deshin, still holding on to the bowl, and looking at her expectantly. All right. Letsy took the bowl, as it was slowly offered over, and reached in, moving the cubes around. They weren't much to look at, but this wasn't her circle of friends, and they were offering her food. That mattered. I promise, she said with conviction. Good. In that case, I advise you to try the dark ones, Deshin said firmly, as Melondi played with the remote. They're called Kit Kats. What's the difference? She looked at the cubes a bit. They were all red, but some of the sticks pictured on the side seemed dark, and some seemed to be brown. Try one each. Melondi reached over and picked out 2, settling them down before drawing out 2 for herself. I like the light ones. Letsy looked down at one of the cubes and turned it over in her hands. Watching as Deshin tore the wrapper end back, she followed suit, revealing the dark brown surface, as the screen went black and the music faded. She looked up and found the subtitles. Remember, remember, the 5th of November. Dinner out with Sholea hadn't been what he'd expected. After months with Mevere, he had a pretty good idea of her as a person. When she wasn't in the academy suit or dress, she tended to wear short jackets and wore her hair pulled back in a cut that flowed over her shoulders. She kept in shape. The endurance walk she preferred for exercise kept her toned. In conversation, Mevere was proper but kind, funny, open, yielding, and even solicitous, yet still very much her own person with her own ideas. Despite their awkward meeting, he'd expected Sholea to be at least somewhat like Miv. It seemed reasonable that once Leah calmed down, the things they had in common would manifest themselves, and he could get to know her from there. Life was what happened when you made other plans. Sholea had been unfeignedly courteous and picked him up on time, and they managed their share of small talk on the drive to the restaurant she selected. They'd gotten as far as calling each other Leah and Tom, and he'd worked through his store of small talk by the time they arrived. That was when the problem started. It hadn't helped that several of the diners recognized him from the interview when they came into the restaurant. There were whispers, and a few even pointed, and Tom felt Leia stiffen up even as their conversation slowed to a crawl. It felt ridiculous. He hadn't even seen the thing. After the Baroness of Galetratori introduced herself and started fawning her way in between Leah and himself, he managed to politely disengage the woman by accepting her contact information, but by then Leah had shut down entirely. Dinner was rigid, but it gave him time to consider his date. It wasn't that Sholea wasn't pretty. She was, but where Mevere was tastefully dressed and fit, Sholea was spare. Her dress was stylish, but she wore almost no jewelry. She was nearly the same height as Mevere's 7'1", maybe a little shorter, and she was fit, but on the thin side. She was attractive, even pretty in a certain severe point of view, but where Miv's hair was styled and moved about just over her shoulders, Sholea's was straight and long. She wore it long down over one shoulder, clasped by a silver filigree hairpin. It was the only piece of jewellery she was wearing. Sholea was pretty, but it was like there were no frills to the woman. Sitting in the booth, he picked at the dinner she ordered for them. It had been very good, even if he couldn't identify most of it. The irksome thing was that he could still see the occasional diner pointing at him. While it irritated him, it seemed to bother Leah even more, and he watched as she leaned down over her plate, taking another bite. The silence was getting on his nerves. Given a Shil'vati-sized portion, there was a lot left on his plate, but he was already full. Without the routine of eating, the silence grew oppressive. He looked over at Leah and smiled. That was a very nice meal. The turox was just right, but what do you call the sauce? Oriman, she said absently, picking at something orange on her plate. It's a fruit that grows on Willist. I have a student from Willist. He looked down at the sauce with a new appreciation. It reminded him of teriyaki, but not quite. A nice girl. I'm sure, she said, setting down her fork and looking over at him. Miv tells me almost all the students there are nice. She tells me you teach at a school in, Crintauri? Criantauri, she nodded, looking down at her plate again. It's not the academy by any means, it's poor. I don't have many resources, but I do my best to provide a good education. Well, thank you for not getting upset about that. I suppose we can't all be the Baroness of Gilead Trattori, he quipped and offered her a smile. She stiffened. Oh. Look, I want you to know I'm enjoying dinner. And I apologize. I didn't think the interview I gave would get any attention. I've never had anyone point at me before. He grimaced, hoping she'd understood. Sholea didn't earn a lot of credits, and while the meal seemed nice, he suddenly wondered how much of a paycheck this had cost her. While they shared a home, it seemed unlikely that Leah would accept help from Miv to take him out on a date. I promise, if I'd had any idea, we could have done something else. I didn't need any of this to have a good time. Oh? Sholea set her silverware aside and looked down at the table, not quite meeting his eyes. What do you need? She asked, in a voice of quiet resignation. I don't know, he said, pushing his plate away slightly and looking at Leah. A lover that won't drive me crazy? What? I'm sorry. That's a human song by John Cougar. It was a dumb answer, but it sort of popped into my head. He sighed. Confusion washed over Leah's face. Merveille would have known he was going off on one of his tangents, but Leah... I just need to be able to enjoy the person I'm with. Cougar? Leah frowned a bit. Merveille said that's a bad word on your world for women. You mean... No. I mean, yes, it's a bad word for women, but it was the singer's name, John Cougar. Then it was John Cougar Mellencamp, then just John Mellencamp. He held up his hands quickly. Great, I'm babbling like an idiot. It was a song by a man named Cougar, which is also an animal. Has nothing to do with women, I promise. All right. Leah canted her head, but was still frowning slightly, as she considered him. So, what is it about, if not the cougar? By John Cougar, not about cougars, he said firmly, gathering his thoughts. It's actually pretty shallow advice about relationships, but it has a fantastic guitar solo. It's catchy and memorable. I guess that's about it. The song is just about being young and alive and having fun. I mean, what did you do for fun growing up? Growing up? Sholea looked at him uncomfortably. I grew up in Criantauri. My family never had the money for much, but my father made sure I always had enough. My clothes were never new, but they were always clean. He made sure I studied. He and my two mothers did all that they could, so I'd be better off than they were. And now you teach school there? He asked thoughtfully. Yes. We never had money. Having fun when I grew up meant hanging out on the streets with my friends or a book from the library. I worked my way out, but I wanted to teach. Wanted the children there to have opportunities too. She nodded slowly, looking up from the table to meet his eyes. When I met Mavera, I never expected to join her family. I guess I know I'm sensitive about it. I'm proud of what I've accomplished, but sometimes it's still hard. When I run into someone like that Baroness, I kind of shut down. I can understand that. Tom looked into her eyes, trying to hold her attention, and nodded when she cantered ahead. I mean, I was never poor, but my stepsister? She was well off before the landing and still is. Rich, really. I know how hard it is to be around people with money when you don't. And growing up, always feeling like you're never going to meet people's expectations. I love my stepsister, but I always felt like the odd one out. The one on the side, she nodded. Mavera never made me feel that way, but I worried about it for a long time. Ever since Chanda died, I guess I always expected to end up back where I started. It took me a long time before I started to feel safe again, and then she met you. I've kind of made a mess of tonight. Is it meaningless to apologize? Never. But you don't have anything to apologize for. Tom shook his head as he considered Leah. It was awkward, but all too understandable. You know she loves you, right? I do, and I think she loves you. Sholea looked over at the nearest woman staring their way and stuck her tongue out, before turning back to Tom with an impish grin. It made him smile. You're right. I do love Miv. You love Miv. Miv loves you. Which is about the point where my human brain starts to melt down and wonder how this works from here, he said ruefully. Look, I think going out for drinks is out, given how people are acting. Imagine we were a few days down the road. What would you like to do instead? Sholea blushed furiously. Okay, maybe not that far down the road, he grinned. We have the whole night left. What would you like to do? Actually, no one will ever forget that night and what it meant for this country. Evie's voice settled over the room as the orchestra swelled and fireworks rose over the alien city. But I will never forget the man and what he meant to me. At least it has their classical music, breathed Prasala. But great goddess, I don't think we'll let anyone else see that one. Probably not, though it was good, wasn't it? Asked Scifi, as Melondi turned down the volume. Humans can't absorb damage from guns like that, Leslie said doubtfully. Can they? Probably not, Nessa nodded. My housekeeper says never to try and outdrink one, though. You don't think they look at the Imperium like that, do you? Leslie still wasn't sure she had a voice in this group, but offered it up. It seemed like a fair question, if the others had already seen several of these films. No, Melondi said tentatively. I'm starting to think they get the idea of empires all wrong. Anything taken to extremes or put in the wrong hands, like that, is going to turn out badly. Well, it's not a story about good winning over evil. Lexi looked over at Mel, as the girls all started talking about what they thought of the film. Kellogg had passed her more of the chocolates halfway through the film. Everyone was picking up. It was comfortable. Not like being around Desala and her circle of older girls. Not at all. I mean, I think it maybe does, but it's looking at where that evil comes from in the first place. Tom sat back and kicked his legs in the water. The pool at Miv and Leia's house was wonderful. The water was warm but not hot. The evening air of fall had dropped the temperature to what the Shil'vati considered a cool 79 degrees. and there wasn't a mosquito for light years. He looked out over the edge of the terrace, that spilled down towards the sea, and nodded. It was perfect. He still felt ridiculous in the black disco shirt, but at least he'd been able to kick his pants off and sit there in his shorts. The chop-ins were off to the side, and he gave them a dirty look, but all things considered, he couldn't complain. Watching Sholea glide beneath the water to him, he grinned as she bobbed to the surface with barely a ripple, and slipped one hand over the lip of the pool. "So, of all the things you could have picked, this is your perfect date?" he asked, looking down into the midnight and gold of her eyes. She grinned impulsively. "Where I grew up, there was a communal pool, you know. But this... Every Shil'vati loves to swim, but this..." Leah slipped underwater a moment, and pulled her hair back before surfacing. "When we found this house, I thought I was dreaming." "I have to admit, I was just thinking this is perfect. I can see why you and Miv didn't give it up." He nodded. "Next time I'll bring something to swim in, so I can do more than kick my feet in the water." "So, there's going to be a next time," she grinned crookedly, and pushed away from the side of the pool, effortlessly treading water. Regarding him a moment, she treaded water just out of reach. "You asked what I wanted to do, so if we're having a next time, what do you want?" Tom leaned back and looked up at the stars. Streaks of light climbed for eternity as ships lifted from the spaceport, but the stars were coming into view as dusk took hold. "Was that your humming?" She canted her head. "Miv told me all about it, but I've never heard you do it." I suppose it's a song about what I want," he said after a moment, and smiled. "I hadn't been thinking about it until you asked what I wanted, but yeah, I think so." "So?" Leah grinned, bobbing a bit closer. "Are you going to sing it for me?" Well, it may sound odd. I don't think I could sing it in Shil'vati and have it sound right." He looked at her thoughtfully, as she bobbed in the water at his feet, and he extended one leg out beside her. "I could speak it." Leah reached out and slipped a hand over his leg, drawing herself up beside him. "All right. How does it go?" "No one but myself to blame, if I don't have a love to call my own." Tom closed his eyes and felt the warm water. Leah's hand wrapped gently about his leg, and he leaned back, reciting as the chorus played in his mind. "Maybe it takes some chipping away before you get down to the cornerstone. How much gold can you find if you never go mining? The wine gets better if you let it breathe." Tom smiled as he recited the lyrics. He could see Miv and Leia together now, and it was safe to say he never expected this in his life. But here he was. The deeper the digging, the sweeter the finding. I want to know what's underneath.